Right after Davos, the next weekend, I will travel to India. There's still work to do, but we are on the cusp of a historic trade agreement. Indeed, some call it the mother of all deals. One that would create a market of 2 billion people, accounting for almost a quarter of global GDP. And crucially, that would provide a first-mover advantage for Europe with one of the world's fastest-growing and most dynamic continents.
We aim to conclude negotiations on the EU-India Free Trade Agreement. This deal will open markets, remove barriers and strengthen critical supply chains in clean technologies, pharmaceuticals and semiconductors. Second, today we agreed to move forward with the signature of a new EU-India security and defence partnership in areas like maritime security, cybersecurity and counter-terrorism. We will also launch negotiations on a security of information agreement. In a more dangerous world, we will both gain from working closer together.
Did you hear that? 450 million consumers, a 250,000 car quota per year, and tariff cuts covering about 96.6% of what Europe sells into India. After decades of stalled talks, the EU and India just landed what officials are openly calling the mother of all trade deals, and the timing is the tell. While Washington keeps reaching for tariffs as a pressure weapon, Europe is signing corridors. First Mercosur, now India. That's not paperwork. That's Europe hedging against U.S. unpredictability and against China's gravitational pull by building a third pole it can actually trade through. Here's the straight news before the analysis. The EU-India deal slashes India's sky-high car tariffs down toward 10% over roughly 5 years, but with a quota, about 250,000 vehicles a year. So India opens the door without letting the whole house flood. Big tariff walls on EU machinery, chemicals, and pharmaceuticals get reduced or mostly eliminated. EU aircraft and spacecraft tariffs are set to be eliminated for almost all products. Alcohol gets staged cuts. Think roughly 20-30% on wine, 40% on spirits, 50% on beer, while some processed food tariffs drop to zero. On the EU side, the bloc says it will eliminate or reduce tariffs on about 99.5% of goods it imports from India within 7 years. And EU officials say the outcome could save around 4 billion euros a year in duties on European products and potentially double EU goods exports to India by 2032. Now the real story. This deal is not Europe falling in love with India. It's Europe building an exit route from a trap. Because Europe is wedged between two forces that don't care about European comfort. On one side, U.S. coercion, tariffs used not just against rivals, but increasingly as a tool to discipline partners. On the other side, China's gravity, an ecosystem of manufacturing scale, supply chains, and pricing power that pulls markets into Beijing's orbit even when governments don't want the politics that come with it. Europe's answer is to create options, not speeches options. Market access, standards corridors, supply routes that can survive a tariff tantrum in Washington or a supply shock in Asia. That's why you should read EU-India and EU-Mercosur as parts of one strategy, even though they look different on paper. Mercosur is the food and raw materials plus industrial access play, and it instantly triggered farmer backlash because European agriculture sees exactly what's coming, more competition from lower-cost producers, and a political class willing to trade farm stability for strategic leverage. India is a different kind of play. The protected giant opens carefully. India has historically defended its market with some of the world's most stubborn tariffs. So the headline is not simply free trade. The headline is controlled opening, quotas, staged reductions, selective liberalization, India giving Europe access, but on terms designed to protect domestic producers while still attracting investment, technology, and export growth. So who wins, and who feels the heat first? Europe's clear winners are the sectors that were boxed out by India's tariff walls. They include automakers, especially premium, machinery, chemicals, high-value manufacturing, and pharmaceuticals. If you're a European exporter, India is no longer just a future market. It's a market you can price into, plan around, and scale into. India's winners are more complex, but just as real. They include exporters whose products face fewer barriers entering Europe, plus service sectors that gain privileged access in areas like financial and maritime services. And strategically, India wins by positioning itself as the third pole partner everyone wants. A massive market, a production base, and a geopolitical counterweight that lets Europe diversify without choosing China. But the people most likely to feel the disruption and to protest are the ones exposed to competition with thinner margins. In Europe, the agricultural anxiety doesn't magically disappear just because the partner is India instead of Brazil or Argentina. If lower-cost imports expand, European farmers will ask the same question they asked on Mercosur. Are we being regulated into higher costs at home while competing with imports produced under different conditions? In India, domestic manufacturers, especially in sensitive sectors like autos, will watch the quota numbers like a hawk. Because a 10% car tariff is not protection, it's competition with a seatbelt. The quota is the seatbelt. If the quota rises later, expect political pressure inside India too. Now zoom out. How does this help the EU against American tariff pressure? It does three things, quietly, but structurally. First, it reduces Europe's vulnerability to US leverage. Tariffs work best when the target has no alternatives. India is an alternative, big enough to matter. Not as a replacement for the US market overnight, but as a credible second engine that changes negotiating psychology in Brussels. It's harder to bully someone who has options. Second, it reshapes supply chains and standards gravity. When a deal this large sets rules on market access, compliance, and sector openings, companies start aligning production, sourcing, and investment to match the rule setter. The US has been used to setting the rules. Deals like this shift some rule-setting power back toward Brussels, especially in regulated sectors. This is an inference from how large trade deals typically work, not a promise that it happens automatically. Third, it creates a political message. Europe is not waiting for Washington's mood swings to settle. It's building a trade map where the US is not the only gatekeeper to prosperity. How would Trump likely read this? Not as trade policy, as defiance. From a Trump world lens, the EU signing mega deals while Washington threatens tariffs looks like allies preparing for a post-US order, an order where multilateralism is another word for we're not obeying your leverage. So the risk is escalation. More tariff threats, more pressure campaigns, and more demands that partners align with US restrictions, especially on China-related supply chains. But here's the irony. The more tariffs become America's default language, the more deals like EU-India become rational. That leads to your big question. Is America being increasingly isolated in trade? Not isolated as in no trade, isolated as in outside the new architecture. The US still has huge market gravity. But the architecture, the web of preferential access, standards corridors, and block-to-block deals, has been expanding without Washington at the center. When Europe signs Mercosur and then signs India, it's stitching trade routes that reduce dependence on a single power's permission structure. And China? China watches this with two reactions at once. On the surface, China loses some exclusivity. India becomes more attractive as a production and market alternative. But strategically, China also benefits from Western fragmentation. If the US is outside major trade blocs while the EU builds its own network, partners have more room to play powers off each other. China doesn't need to be the only pole. It just needs the West to stop acting like one bloc. Now, Canada. Where does Canada sit in this? Canada isn't a headline player in the EU-India deal, but it's not untouched. The immediate risk is competitive. If EU exporters gain better terms in India, Canadian exporters can find themselves less competitive, especially in sectors where price and tariff margins matter. But Canada also has an opportunity if it plays like a middle power with a strategy. Become a bridge economy for firms hedging across US-EU-India corridors. In plain language, when trade routes reroute, stable jurisdictions with strong legal systems and predictable rules become staging grounds, HQs, financing hubs, services hubs, and sometimes production hubs. Canada can win that role if Ottawa is intentional about industrial policy, critical minerals strategy, and market diversification. If not, it just watches others write the map. So what should viewers watch next? What are the pressure points? Watch ratification and implementation timelines because big deals are easy to announce and hard to operationalize. Watch the quota mechanics, especially the car quota. Quotas are political pressure valves. If they expand, backlash expands. Watch the carbon and standards friction points, especially anything tied to EU climate rules and border measures, because those can become the next fight even after a deal is signed. And watch Washington's countermove, not what it says on microphones, but what it does through tariff threats, procurement rules, and behind-the-scenes pressure on allies to pick sides. Because that's the deeper lesson of this moment. Global trade is no longer just who sells what. It's who can build corridors when someone else tries to rule by choke points. And Europe is making its vote clear. If the world is moving toward a new multilateral order, it won't arrive as a speech at the UN. It will arrive as signed market access, staged tariff schedules, quota numbers, and supply chains that quietly stop routing through a single superpower's permission. That's what this EU-India deal really is. This is Liberation Lens. Perspective matters.